Today, for the first time, Cuba's dictator acknowledged talks with the United States after intense economic pressure from the Trump administration. Joining us now with more is Kevin Cork. Good evening, Kevin.
Evening, Charlie. There are actually three prongs to this Cuba story tonight that collectively seem to be pointing to a major change in the island in the not-too-distant future. On the one hand, the biggest news of the day is, as you pointed out, Cuba's President Miguel Díaz-Canel confirming today that his government is negotiating with the Trump administration and that talks are serious and sensitive. Now, those conversations signal a potentially historic and economic and strategic partnership with the U.S., which would be massive.
Cuba's communist dictator just made a move against Trump, and it blew up in his face instantly. Díaz-Canel spent years threatening American power from 90 miles off the Florida coast, but 3 months of a U.S.-led oil embargo drained the fuel, killed the lights, and put his own people in the streets. Now he's sitting at the negotiating table, confirming talks with the Trump administration are, quote, serious and sensitive. Cuba released 51 political prisoners the same day, a Vatican-brokered signal that the pressure is working. Allegedly, Rubio reached all the way to Raúl Castro's grandson. Here's what nobody's saying out loud yet. The consequences closing in on Díaz-Canel right now could end his presidency permanently. What exactly did Trump threaten that forced a communist strongman to fold?
By the way, the announcement comes as the island continues to struggle and suffer through some of its worst economic shock in history, thanks in part to the U.S.-led oil embargo, which has kept fuel from entering the country for about 3 months. The resulting lack of energy, food, and rolling blackouts leading to unprecedented protests, which have, frankly, called into question the leadership's effete grip on the island's enkindled masses. Now, the talks, if successful, could potentially lead to Cuba's biggest economic opening since the nationalization of its economy all the way back in 1961 in the wake of the Cuban Revolution. Perhaps not coincidentally, today the Cuban government announced the release of 51 people from the island's prisons as part of a Vatican-brokered deal. There have, by the way, Charlie, been multiple reports that Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been engaged in direct high-level dialogue with a number of the island's top brass, including Raúl Castro's grandson, Raulito. No confirmation of that from the State Department of the White House. Then again, no denial either. Charlie.
Cuba is an island nation 90 miles off the coast of Florida. For over 60 years, a communist regime has run it, first under Fidel Castro, now under a man named Miguel Díaz-Canel. The Cuban people have no real elections, no free press, and no economic future. The regime spent decades aligning with America's enemies, Russia, China, Venezuela, and letting drug traffickers use the island as a transit hub. American presidents called it an unsolvable problem and walked away. President Trump did not. His team cut off Cuba's oil supply by neutralizing Venezuela first. Now Cuba is in the dark, literally, with blackouts stretching 30 to 40 hours, hospitals canceling surgeries, and citizens taking to the streets. Díaz-Canel just walked in front of cameras and admitted live that Cuba is in talks with the United States. He surrendered. Here's exactly how that moment unfolded. Cuba's dictator had spent weeks puffing his chest out, calling American pressure fascist, calling Trump genocidal, swearing Cuba would never bend. Then the lights went out and kept going out. When a government cannot keep the electricity on, the speeches stop mattering. Díaz-Canel went on state television this week, and what he said left absolutely no room for spin.
Que en correspondencia con la política consistente que siempre ha presentado la Revolución Cubana, bajo la dirección del general de ejército como líder histórico de nuestra revolución y la mía, y colegiado con las principales instancias del partido, el gobierno y el Estado cubano, funcionarios cubanos sostuvieron recientemente conversaciones con representantes del gobierno de los Estados Unidos para buscar por la vía del diálogo la posible solución a las diferencias bilaterales que existen entre nuestras dos naciones. Estos intercambios han sido favorecidos por actores internacionales. Y aquí me quiero detener. Siempre que hemos estado en situaciones tensas en las relaciones con los Estados Unidos, aparecen esfuerzos por buscar canales de diálogo, por buscar conversaciones. No es la primera vez que Cuba entra en una conversación de este tipo. Yo creo que la más reciente, el ejemplo más reciente, fue la manera en que el general de ejército condujo las conversaciones con el presidente Obama en una etapa muy reciente, y todos sabemos los resultados que dieron esas conversaciones. Bueno, ahora también algún grupo de actores internacionales favorecieron el desarrollo de esos intercambios. ¿Cuáles son los propósitos que estamos siguiendo con estas conversaciones, con los propósitos que nos hemos planteado? Bueno, en primer lugar, determinar cuáles son los problemas bilaterales que necesitan solución.
He compared these talks to the Obama-era negotiations, like that is somehow the same situation. It is not even close. Obama walked in offering relief. The Trump administration walked in with Venezuela already in hand and cut off 60% of Cuba's oil supply overnight. Díaz-Canel is not at the table because he wants to be. He is at the table because there is nowhere else left to go. And he keeps talking, laying out what Cuba says it wants from these conversations.
Developing now, the Trump administration is reportedly close to making a deal with Cuba. The possible agreement could mark a significant shift in relations between the two countries. Local 10 Janine stand with us live now in Little Havana with more on this potential turning point. Janine.
The administration has already taken action on Venezuela, and now its sights are set on Cuba. That is no secret, but now we're learning, as you said, there could be a deal. Blackouts and unrest continue in Cuba as oil and tourism dollars dry up. Now, a surprise economic deal between the U.S. and the communist island is in the works. That's according to USA Today. Sources say an agreement could include a relaxation on travel, deals on ports and energy, and an out for current leader Miguel Díaz-Canel. Congressman Carlos Jimenez this morning.
It has to lead to a transition away from these dictators, from these authoritarian regimes.
Solve bilateral differences through dialogue. That is the diplomatic translation of, we are out of oil, our economy has stopped, our people are rioting, and we need this pressure to end. The Monroe Doctrine is not a theory anymore. It is the operating policy of the United States government, enforced in real time with real consequences. Now, the regime did not just make a speech. Hours before that address, Cuban state media dropped another announcement. The government said it would release 51 prisoners in the coming days. The timing is deliberate. It is a good faith signal to Washington, a way of saying we can work with you, just ease up. Reporters in Miami's Little Havana neighborhood went straight to the Cuban exile community for reaction. And what they found was cautious hope mixed with 65 years of earned skepticism.
President Trump over the weekend repeating hints of change.
We're also looking forward to the great change that will soon be coming to Cuba. Cuba's at the end of the line.
But USA Today also reports the possibility the Castro family, the power of the regime, would be able to stay on the island.
So we trap you here.
Here in South Florida, where tours on Cuban culture crowd Calle Ocho, exiles like activist Ramon Saul Sanchez are skeptical.
We cannot, ahead of time, have a situation in which they deal with a dictator to do business.
Bueno, funcionarios cubanos sostuvieron recientemente conversaciones con representantes del gobierno de los Estados Unidos para buscar por la vía del diálogo la posible solución a las diferencias bilaterales que existen entre nuestras.
Those Cuban Americans are right to demand more than a prisoner release. Their families were forced off that island. They have watched deal after deal with Havana collapse into nothing. But look at what actually happened here. The regime released prisoners right before a nationally televised address from the dictator himself. That sequence mirrors Venezuela almost exactly. When Maduro's government felt the full weight of American economic pressure, political prisoners started walking out of jails. The playbook is identical because the strategy is identical.
Now at 11, we begin with major breaking news. All eyes on Cuba as Cuban leader Miguel Díaz-Canel is set to make an announcement tomorrow morning. And in another rare move, the regime is also announcing tonight that it will release 51 prisoners in the next few days. Cuban officials did not specify if those being freed are political prisoners. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lauren Pastrana. Tonight's announcements come as the future of the island remains uncertain. CBS News Miami's Anna McAllister is your reporter live in Little Havana. She joins us from Versailles Restaurant with reaction tonight. Anna?
Lauren, I spoke to Dr. Andy Gomez, and he told us that first and foremost, we need to figure out who these 51 prisoners are. And he told me that he does believe this is a positive step in the right direction, but he did say that he is cautiously optimistic.
Al siguiente comunicado del Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores.
A bombshell dropping Thursday night from Cuban state media after announcing their government will release 51 prisoners in the coming days, adding Cuba's leader, Miguel Díaz-Canel, will address the nation Friday morning.
I think they just made a first step, if you will, of good faith, showing that the United States that they're willing to do something.
Andy Gomez has studied the Cuban conflict for years and says there's a few huge questions surrounding the release of these prisoners.
Who are the 51? Are they willing to release more political prisoners? And how is Washington going to react?
In Cuba's social media post about the prisoners' release, it says the nation has pardoned more than 9,900 people and sanctioned at least 10,000 others since 2010. This announcement about the release of the prisoners coming as the nation is in a humanitarian and economic crisis.
Cuba finds themselves in a very difficult position, and they understand nobody's coming to save them.
Last month, Cuban leader Miguel Díaz-Canel said he was willing to speak to President Trump about the future of Cuba. Cuba is willing to engage in dialogue with the United States on any topic, but without pressure or preconditions, and always respecting Cuba's sovereignty and independence. But it's still unclear exactly what Díaz-Canel will say during his televised speech, something that rarely happens.
The Cuban exile community in South Florida wants full regime change, and that is a completely legitimate demand. But what we are witnessing right now is the first real crack in that wall in 60 years. The regime is publicly admitting weakness on state television. That never happened under Obama. It never happened under Biden. It is happening now. And the reason it is happening now traces back to a decision made in January that most of the corporate press underplayed entirely. Venezuela was not a side story in all of this. Venezuela was the foundation. The architecture of this entire Latin America strategy was built on one core insight: control the energy, and you control the outcome.
This is NBC6 Breaking News Now.
Thanks for joining us for the continuing coverage of President Díaz-Canel from Cuba announcing working relationships now, talking relationships with the U.S. government. We've been following this since 7:30 this morning when that announcement first started.
Yeah, the president there announced that they have been without oil and gasoline for 3 months now. You can assume that that's as soon as the capture of Nicolás Maduro, January 3rd, they were cut off essentially of their 60% of oil imports that they would receive from the Venezuelan government, essentially leaving them without electricity, without a sustainable water supply. They had been seeing blackouts, and interesting enough, shortly ago, they said that they've had 30 to 40 hours of blackouts. But what he did say was he wasn't necessarily blaming the government or the revolution, but rather the energy blockade that obviously was imposed by the Trump administration. This is interesting. We've known that hospitals have been challenged by this energy crisis. We know that schools and universities have been challenged by the fact that they don't have internet access. And they said tens of thousands of people, including children, waiting for surgeries due to the lack of electricity. That is something that Díaz-Canel announced a short time ago in this news conference. We've been listening in and we've been trying to translate, but I have to tell you that some of the things that he is saying are just so micro related to, what's happening on the island that it's kind of difficult to keep up with what he's saying. And obviously they're very careful about the way that they word things, and you almost have to read between the lines to understand what is being disseminated onto the island and what's being disseminated through state-run media. So we're putting together essentially context clues to have an understanding of what he's saying. But the big picture here and the takeaway is that the United States and Cuba have been in talks, and they are publicly announcing this. We knew that this could be happening with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, essentially the architect of putting this deal or change or economic sanctions, changes in that were probably happening with him and who he was talking to in the Castro regime. But at this point, now you have Díaz-Canel, who is essentially saying, yes, confirming we are in talks with the United States.
Once Venezuela was neutralized, its oil redirected, its regime broken, its protection of the Cuban government severed, Cuba was left exposed. Russia is not going to sacrifice its strategic interests to rescue a broke island 90 miles from Miami. China runs on calculated self-interest, and Cuba has nothing left to offer. The regime found itself standing alone against an administration that understood exactly where the pressure points were and hit every single one of them.
And we're acting with international actors. That's who's working these dealings. We know yesterday they announced the release of 51, that they're going to start releasing 51 prisoners, but he has not addressed this. At least I have not heard him address that yet, but we know that came out yesterday in Cuban state media.
Yeah, and obviously that is in the heels of this announcement. That is big news for 51 people to be released from the island's jails. It's not clear if who they are exactly, who's going to be released. As we know, there are hundreds who are in the jails there in Cuba. The government saying Thursday night, as you just mentioned hours ago, that 51 people from the island's prisons would be released in the coming days. The government would not identify exactly who would be released, except to say that all have served a significant part of their sentences and have maintained good conduct while in prison. So that gives us an idea of who would be released. But again, as Shelley had mentioned, and she's listening in as well, that we have not heard him speak specifically to that, but that was a big announcement to come in. Breaking news last night that these prisoners would be released leading up to Holy.
That I spoke to said what came out of that news conference isn't news. They know how bad the situation is in Cuba, and they also already said that they knew that Cuba was in talks with the U.S. Here is what one of the Cuban American locals here had to say.
They're finally stating the truth. They can't hide it any further. I think it's been going on for a while, which we've been hearing that has been going on. Marco Rubio has been engaged in conversations with them. But like always, they always lie to us. They've been lying to us for 65 years. As far as, and I'll go a little further, I'll tell you that what I would like to see come out of this is that Canel gets out and Castro gets out. That's the only thing that's acceptable to the community.
Amar, who you just heard from, added again that he will not accept anything than what you just heard for a total regime change in Cuba. He added, though, the reason why he believes that they had this big press conference that they were telling everyone about and that they made it such a big deal is because he says there's starting to be resentment on the street. And so Cuba needed to come out and do something to try and tell people, hey, there's still help on the way. Don't worry, we're taking care of things. We're talking to the U.S. So he said it's just Cuba trying again to suppress the people who are again starting to get upset and show that dissent on the streets. We'll be here all morning.
Marco Rubio's parents fled Cuba. He has spent decades watching that island suffer. He is the architect of this strategy, the right person in the right seat at the right moment in history. And while all of this was unfolding, a second story broke that most of the media buried entirely. Ecuador just made a move that closes off one of Cuba's last remaining backdoors.
De la misma manera, invitamos a la señora María José Pinto, vicepresidenta de la República.
Hoy, la cooperación en seguridad entre los Estados Unidos y el Ecuador alcanza un hito muy importante. La firma de memorando de entendimiento que formaliza la presencia permanente del FBI por primera vez en este país y establece una nueva unidad vetada entre el FBI y la Policía Nacional.
Ecuador formalizing a permanent FBI presence on its soil, a first, is not a procedural footnote. A vetted joint unit between the FBI and Ecuador's national police, specifically targeting cartels and drug trafficking networks, is a direct strike at infrastructure Cuba has long used as a revenue stream. One by one, every economic lifeline the regime relied on is being shut down. The oil gone, the Venezuelan protection gone, the drug corridor in Ecuador now under the eyes of Kash Patel's FBI. This is not chaos, it is chess, and America is several moves ahead.